Hello, and welcome to the Center for Health Design's Evidence-Based Design Journal Club. Thank you for joining us. I'm Alan Card, a research associate at the Center for Health Design, and I'll be your host for today. Before we begin, I'd like to thank the Health Environment's Research and Design Journal for providing free access to the articles we typically review. If you've not already done so, we recommend subscribing to HERD. There's a discount code for attendees to receive 10% off the subscription using code HERD10, that's HERD10. The purpose of the Evidence-Based Design Journal Club is to engage the healthcare design community in dialogue regarding important research and to help us better understand the links between the built environment and health-related outcomes and apply it in the real world. Sorry, it's just got resized on me. Continuing education units are available for this webinar from the AIA and from EDAC. To receive credit for your participation, you can download the forms at any time by clicking on the Show My Media Library icon, which is located on the top toolbar where the red arrow is pointing. You'll have access to the AIA quiz, the EDAC form, and today's presentation slides. To download a file, click on the green arrow next to the file. When you're finished, click on the double right arrow in the top left corner of the media library. The library will close and the slides will refill the empty space. For EDAC credit, complete the verification form and retain it for your records. You'll need to submit the form to Castle Worldwide at the time of your renewal. For AIA credit, complete the verification quiz, purchase a CEU management fee for $10 from the CHD's store, and submit the verification form to Catherine Anchetta. She'll upload the credits to your AIA account. You'll find Catherine's email address included on the form. I'd like to take a moment to review how to use the chat feature so you can ask questions or submit comments on what you hear today. As shown on this slide, just type into the chat box where the red arrow is pointing. Please be sure to chat your questions to all so that all attendees on today's call are able to see your message. If you're having technical difficulties, please type your issue to moderator in private conversation and we'll see how we can help. I'd now like to introduce you to the authors of the article we're going to be discussing today, Upali Nanda, Sophia Rybkowski, and Bernita Beichman. Upali Nanda is a published author, speaker, and researcher with extensive experience in designing, spearheading, and implementing research projects in design practice. Her research focuses on the impact of design on human health, organizational effectiveness, and systemic well-being. She is the Director of Research for HKS, responsible for spearheading and implementing research projects globally. She also serves as the Executive Director for the nonprofit Center for Advanced Design Research and Education. She's a member of the Academy of Neuroscience for Architecture, ANFA, Advisory Council, the AIA Research Advisory for Design and Health, and the AAH Research Council. Additionally, she serves as a member of the editorial boards for Healthcare Environments Research and Design Journal and the Journal of Hospital Administration. Her doctoral work on synthetics has been published as a book available on Amazon.com, and she has published extensively in peer-reviewed journals and mainstream media. Her research has been awarded the European Healthcare Design Research Award and 2 IDRA Core Awards, and she has been the recipient of numerous national grants. In 2015, Dr. Nanda was recognized as one of the top 10 most influential people in healthcare design for research by Healthcare Design magazine. Sophia Rybkowski is an associate professor in the Department of Construction Science of the College of Architecture at Texas A&M University. Her research experience includes integrated project delivery, productivity analysis and lean construction, simulation development and testing, target value design, life cycle cost analysis, sustainable design, and evidence-based design. She has extensive experience as a construction, architectural, and engineering researcher and as a consultant. She has consulted for firms in Boston, San Francisco, Tokyo, and Hong Kong, and has offered lean and target value design workshops to such varied organizations as the Penrose St. Francis Healthcare and Walt Disney Imagineering. Dr. Rybkowski holds degrees from Stanford, Brown, Harvard, and the Hong Kong University for Science and Technology, and the University of California, Berkeley. She earned her BS in Biology from Stanford University, MS in Biology from Brown University, Master of Architecture degree in Architecture from the Harvard Graduate School of Design, and her MS and PhD in Civil and Environmental Engineering from the University of California, Berkeley. Dr. Rybkowski teaches Lean IPD to advanced construction science students at Texas A&M University. She's a fellow at the Center for Health Systems and Design at the Institute for Applied Creativity, and she is a lead AP. Bernita Beichman is a principal with HKS Incorporated, Executive Vice President and Director of Project Delivery for the Health Group. She has served integral roles as a project architect, project manager for HKS for the last 22 years, and as a coach and facilitator for project teams. As a Lean Six Sigma Black Belt, she works with all departments at HKS to improve internal processes. Ms. Beichman is currently serving on the Joint Committee for the AIA and AGC and the LCI Board. Thank you, all three of you, for joining us today.
Pleasure.
As I mentioned, we're hosting this event to identify the everyday practical applications of research findings in a published article. Today's featured article, A Value Analysis of Lean Process in Target Value Design and Integrated Project Delivery, Stakeholder Perceptions, from the Health Environments Research and Design Journal. On today's call, we'll have an active discussion about different key factors in your study. And at this point, I'd like to turn it over to the authors. Thank you again so much.
Thank you, Alan. I hope we can all live up to that introduction. So without further ado, we want to get into the presentation, but first we wanted to acknowledge members of our research team who are not on the webinar today, Dr. Adele Najadi, Cipra Pati, John Bianco, and Dr. Rybkowski's student, D.I. Also, we wanted to acknowledge that the project was funded by the AIA Academy of Architecture for Health Foundation. So a huge thanks to them, as well as the support from Bolt and HKS in matching funds. So let's start with giving you a quick overview of what we're going to talk about today. The three of us here bring a variety of skill sets to you. I'm the researcher on the project who knew very little about Lean IPD before we started working together. Dr. Rybkowski is the academic expert, and Bernita is the practice expert on this subject. So we hope that we will be able to have a very productive discussion session. When we started the project, we had 4 key questions, and what is bolded on your screen over there is going to be the emphasis of our talk here today. So our first question was, what do key stakeholders consider to be the advantages and the challenges of using lean thinking tools in the integrated project delivery process? We also wanted to understand, what does value really mean, and how do stakeholders define it and track their quality metrics? Is that explicit? Is it implicit? Is it something that we need to think about how to track? Can we develop a framework for collecting quality metrics that can allow us to do this benefit cost analysis? And how can we, in particular AE firms, track benefits and costs related to the design decision-making process? At the bottom of your screen here, you will see a link to the PDF of the full report, which is openly accessible through the Academy. Our focus here is really on the journal article that we published in HERD, which addressed the first question. But before we start, we want to make sure that we have a deep understanding of the terms that we are using, and I'll hand that over to Zofia.
Thanks, Upali. So integrated project delivery, some of the bullets that we look to when we decide whether our contract actually is an IPD contract. Usually it's a multi-party contract. We usually have early involvement at key, which difference why it's so incredibly important and results in different outcomes. It's very collaborative decision-making and control. The idea is that you leave your hat at the door. People are really able to speak freely and comfortably and based on the merit of their arguments. There's a shared risk and reward structure, so actually there should be some sort of way to ensure that collaboration is rewarded. Liability waivers among key participants so that people are not worried endlessly about being sued, and jointly develop project goals, something that multiple people have buy-in on and feel that they are committed to. And then the IPD contract is between the OAEC partners or stakeholders, the owner, architecture, engineering, construction, and that ensures that risk is shared. So one possible approach to this is where all the partners put their profit at risk until they're able to bring a project down to a point that is financially viable for the owner. So we'll talk a little bit about that. There's something called pain sharing, which was used in this particular project. There's also something we'll call gain sharing as well, which is used in many target value design projects. But anyway, this is kind of to give you a nice overview of some of the general attributes of an IPD project. There are a number of definitions of lean construction, and the one that I tend to like a great deal includes not just reducing waste and adding value, which are obviously very critical to lean. Many of you may be familiar with something called lean manufacturing, and so but you also want to make sure you include something called continuous improvement. So it's not just simply reducing waste and add value, but it's not a one-stop deal. I mean, you're doing this incrementally over time, and it's done in a culture of respect, which basically we say in the lean world, we say with every pair of hands comes a free brain. And so you can actually accomplish a great deal more if you start by acknowledging that there's a lot of people in your team who have a tremendous amount of expertise that they can bring to the table. Why is this so unique? I mean, honestly, when we talk about projects, you may have heard of, the three-legged stool. We have time, cost, and quality as the three legs, and sometimes we talk about a time-cost trade-off. Many of you are familiar that if you say you want to reduce the schedule, you want to make a project go more quickly, that it costs more. And so the great promise of lean is that it's a paradigm shift. It says instead of saying there's trade-offs, we can actually improve time, cost, quality, and safety and morale simultaneously. And that just means that we have to do things very differently. On the bottom of this diagram, there's this thing you see there's waste that shrinks and value increases, because if you actually look at any building, no matter how beautiful it is, there's going to be waste embedded in that building. And basically what that means is not that there's plastic bags stuck in your ceilings and things like this, but what it means is opportunities that were lost because money was spent on processes that were very inefficient and wasteful, and that can be converted to value. In target value design, there's some kind of common elements, this idea that, it's got a sort of historical background in target costing, and basically it's a system of profit planning and cost management ensures that new products and services need market-determined price and financial return. If you think about pricing any kind of system, if it's a product, if you actually just say, well, I'm going to price it based on what the cost is and add a profit, I mean, inevitably there's problems because it may very well turn out that no one will buy that product at that cost. So you really start at what customers are willing to pay, and then you get your whole team together and you essentially work backwards. You say, okay, let's see if we can redesign it to accomplish what the customers are willing to pay for, and then hit that cost. And so target value design really works in that direction. It's saying, all right, instead of designing buildings that we really ultimately set out to build and set out to bid and turn out to be much more expensive than the owner can pay for, let's really figure out what the owner can pay from the perspective of their business case, and let's work backwards. Let's see if we can now, redesign this building and design it to meet those constraints and still produce the kind of value that's necessary to the owner. So that you see on the left-hand side, you have this sort of market cost. Then you have a line, which is the allowable cost, and the idea is over time, when you work together as a group, you can actually bring it down to the allowable cost. And then there's even something called sometimes target cost. And so the idea is that you'll see this thing called pain sharing and gain sharing. We'll talk a little bit more about that. There are questions about that, but the idea is that you have until you hit the allowable cost, you have to be able to stop the project if it's not going to be able to go forward, if it's not going to be financially viable. And then the gain sharing is that there's this opportunity to actually garner savings all around. On the right-hand side, you actually see a diagram. I don't know if you can see, but there's these various subsystems. The idea that you can actually take that initial cost, you can drop it by, let's say, 15 to 20%, and not all the subsystems have to shrink equally. In fact, money should be able to flow between subsystems. So let me give an example. Imagine if you want Low-E glass and you install Low-E glass in your building, right? Okay, most of us know that there's usually some kind of premium associated with Low-E glass over other kinds of glass. But if you actually have the mechanical engineer in the room and they know that you have Low-E glass, they could say, well, we can downsize our chillers and we can actually shrink our duct size, the diameter of our duct size. And if the structural engineer is in the room, they can say, well, if you shrunk your duct size, we can actually reduce our floor-to-floor height. So as you can see, the mechanicals and the structural people, they have actually shrunk their portion of the cost, but the glaziers have actually increased their portion of the cost. And that's really critical in targeted value design, to actually set up a contract where people, the various stakeholders, are incentivized to actually share those costs between the various subsystems. Because otherwise, you don't just want to make a cheaper building, you want to make a building that is more appropriate and is actually also higher in value for the particular owner. One of the most important parts about targeted value design is this concept of knowledge sharing early on. On the right-hand side, you'll see some diagrams that were originally proposed by Will Lichtig from Bolt, and he's a lawyer who's been working on IFOA contracts. And you can actually see on the top, in a traditional design project, you will actually have this kind of lazy S-curve, the idea that over time, all the different parties will actually start to understand what's going on in a project. But in target value design, you have many more meetings up front, and that's significant because it means that people are now working with a larger understanding of the project from the very beginning, and so they're not making naive decisions. There's less change orders and less requests for information in the project. There's a lot less waste, where people are basically working under faulty assumptions because you have everybody sort of tuned in on the same screen at the same time and sharing in similar conversations. Before I go any further, because I'm about to hand this over to my colleague, I also want to make sure that I acknowledge Dr. Glenn Ballard and Dr. Iris Chanelad from UC Berkeley, because to a large extent, this is really a brainchild. Target value design is one of those brainchilds that came from there, and of course has now been contributed. Numbers of people have contributed to this, and it's really expanding very quickly, especially in very complicated processes, especially in the healthcare industry.
So a little bit about Project X, and hopefully we don't accidentally use the real name, but there's a chance it could come out. This is a real project. It is, I know you can read the stats that are up there, but just a few things. It is a children's hospital. It did have a high risk OB. It was finished a few years ago, and we also did a post-occupancy evaluation about a year ago. The design process, if you are a designer construction professional on this call, the design process for an IPD project is very different than the design process in a traditional project. You will see that the normal phases that you might see in a traditional process don't even really appear. And it's not that we just renamed those things. It's that the purpose, the intent changed. We have to understand the building, understand how it works. We understand the detail, support that, and then implement it. But you see here that the construction team is with us and present the entire time. And that's important because not only they're evaluating the building from a constructability standpoint, but we also need to have their cost information available to us as we continue with the project. The team structure is a little bit different as well. I mean, we talked about the fact that this is a multi-party agreement. We had an owner's representative on this project. You see also multiple architects and multiple construction managers. That is because they decided that because it was the owner decided that because it was a different type of project, and they couldn't necessarily use the local GC and architect that they typically use. So they hired national experts in pediatrics, national experts in IPD, to actually help with the project. Also national experts in MEP, so CCRD, which is now WSP, partnered with the local MEP firm. The little diagram that you see on the right is really explaining the team structure. So instead of having a team structure that's architects, engineers, landscape architects, et cetera. We actually had cross-functional teams. For the purposes of this project, we called those innovation teams. So they were organized around disciplines, or they were organized around design sets, or maybe even team structure. They had a leader and administrator for those, but they were all cross-functional teams. So I could have a structural innovation team that had engineers, architects, interior designers, trade partners on it, that were all designing the different systems that would not only support the project needs as far as the design, but also support the project goals and metrics. We reported up to a project leadership team. So traditional terms, think about the project managers on your job. We reported up to those groups our recommendations for what was on the project. If there were any issues, the project leadership team would report up to a senior executive team. But most of the time that was only dispute resolution, or if maybe we were doing some things that were beyond scope, or maybe altered some of the goals on the project. But for the most part, everything was taken care of at the team level and the project leadership team level. The decision-making structure was a little bit different. What you see represented in the middle of the slide, those little boxes, represented A3. A3, which, for all intensive purposes, is an 11 by 17 piece of paper. For Toyota, which is what Lean is based on, it is a problem-solving tool. So it is a tool that says, I'm going to use this collaborative tool to solve a particular problem, and if I can't fit all the information, the research, the suggestions, the why is this problem happening on one sheet of paper, my problem is too big and I need to divide it. And so our method of selecting every system, every material, every design solution was using A3s. We had multiple alternatives for every solution. We used another decision-making system called Choosing by Advantages, sometimes, not on most of our major decisions, so that we could both compare the alternatives, the criteria by which we were judging those alternatives, and how they actually compared against the goals and metrics for the project. So as far as managing first cost, one thing to note on IPD projects is we're not just looking at construction costs. We're looking at everything, and that's, I think, pretty important to know that we're not just managing the construction costs, we're managing our own costs as teams that are burning fee against the project. We're managing a lot of the owner's costs sometimes that we can't touch, like equipment and furniture and things like that, and we're looking at those things and comparing them. And I know you can all read the chart that you can see on the right. That isn't a representation of one of our innovation logs. So every idea, every A3, every crazy idea, every viable idea, any idea that any one of those team members had was added to that list. It was evaluated. It had a deadline. It ultimately had a cost associated with it, and those costs were actually placed and tallied and were placed into that chart you see below. And that chart you see below actually represents how far we were from target, which is represented in red, all the ideas we had to actually reduce costs or add value, or it would be in yellow, and anything that's accepted for the 2-week period that we evaluated it was in green. So as you can see, some teams have a little ways to go. Some teams are actually already met their goal. That was a snapshot in time, but that's how we tracked it, and we kept it visible for the team. These are some examples of what those A3s look like. And, we talk a lot about costs when we talk about IPD. I think a lot of times people think, or when we talk about target value delivery, a lot of people think that, well, is TVD just value engineering? And I would say no. First of all, you're doing an analysis on the value for the project, having a clear understanding of what value means to the end customer and to the rest of the team. And you're doing it at a place before rework. You're doing it before it's actually baked into a design, it's coordinated, it's ready to be built. So where value engineering usually causes a lot of disruption. And a lot of times we may be adding costs because it is truly a value analysis that's happening at the right point in the time. So things like terrazzo, which might be a little bit more expensive than other flooring types, were things that we evaluated. And if we determined that it had the best aesthetic quality, it had the best long-term wear, it met the needs of the client both today and in the future, we made sure that we got terrazzo in the job, which we did. Rubber flooring, the same thing. Yes, it has a higher first cost, much higher than some of the traditional flooring materials used in hospitals, but it has a lot greater wearability and a lot greater maintenance costs, but it's also kinder to the people that are walking on it. Glazing, Zofia already mentioned an example where glazing actually sometimes, even if it's higher cost, it can actually reduce costs in other places. If your glazing cost actually, we had LEED goals that we were trying to get to, it actually helped contribute to the sustainability goals, but it also ultimately could reduce costs in other places. Different success metrics. This is just a list of the success metrics that we measure throughout the project, and they're not what you would typically see a design construction team put together or even just an owner put together. It's actually representative of the entire team. So it includes safety things, not only safety in the construction world, participation of the community, participation for the entire team. There were sustainability goals. There were very strong team performance goals that we evaluated throughout the project all the way through to the end of construction. You know, your schedule goals, everyone understands. We actually beat those schedule goals. Quality was very important, both today and in the future. And staff and family satisfaction. So we worked with a lot of users. We actually had family members in our design team, as part of our design team. So keeping the staff and family engaged was important, and making sure that the things that we designed ended up in the end project were also important.
Thank you, Bernita. So with that, we'll get into the methods, but the success metrics were really key because this was the first time that a project was measuring success throughout the design and construction process. So we had that data to start with. Also, there was a parallel study that was done around change engagement that has recently been published in the Journal of Hospital Management, which we can absolutely share the link to. But again, for this project and the findings section, I might go a little quicker on because you do have the journal paper and we want to have enough time for discussion. But one of the things we wanted to do as a research team is try and understand that we were assuming that there was value to lean thinking in IPD. Did that assumption hold true? Did all key stakeholders truly agree with that? And to understand with Zofia and her team, what were the advantages and challenges to using these lean thinking tools? Our methods were very practice-based, right? So we started with what data exists. Because it was a lean IPD project, everything was documented. We had a lot of archival data in the e-builder, including the A3s. So imagine a situation where every design decision has a record of why it was made, what was the rationale, what was the supporting research, and what was the cost associated with that decision. So we looked at that data. We visited the site, of course. We interviewed key members of the project leadership team, either by phone or in person, conducted focus groups, both with the owner, architecture, and construction teams, as well as the design team. And then we sent out a survey to 79 stakeholders, and we had a 60% response rate, which isn't bad. Who were our stakeholders? They came with a range of experience. A majority of them had more than 10 years of experience. But interestingly also, a majority of them had this as their very first lean IPD project. So everybody was learning together. Data collection. Again, like I said, surveys, interviews, focus groups. Mostly our respondents, the highest number were from architects, followed by owners, contractors, and other trade partners after that. So what did we find? I'll again go through some of the key findings very quickly. The first question was, do you think lean IPD process of project delivery is better than non-lean IPD projects? Now, this is a little difficult to read, so I apologize. But Zofia mentioned schedule, cost, quality, safety, and morale. These are things that the literature already attests to having a lot of value. We discovered in our qualitative research prior to the survey that people kept talking about the learning. They kept talking about how much they learned in this process. And when we did the survey results, we found that, yes, schedule and cost did come up at top, especially for general contractors. But learning was an outcome that almost all stakeholders agreed was an improvement on the traditional process. And just to orient you, your solid blue bars are all stakeholders. The very first stripe is the architect. Next to it is the GC with the crosshatch. And next to it is the owner. So that will help as we go through subsequent graphs. The other question we asked was, what did you think was the most valuable lean strategy? Was it the team week meetings? Was it the target value design process that we just heard about? Was it co-location? Because the entire team co-located, no matter where they were in the world, they were co-located in a big room for a majority of the week, every 2 weeks. So that was a significant investment. And then the final thing was full-scale mock-ups, and this was entire departments being mocked up. And as you can see here in the highlighted area, that the full-scale mock-up was rated as the most successful lean strategy across all groups. You can see variances here, right? So target value design, you can see, is rated significantly higher maybe by the GC as compared to other stakeholders. But mock-ups is significantly rated higher for all stakeholders. And here's a quick example of what the full-scale mock-up looked like. This is an entire warehouse with a mock-up, and Bernita kind of alluded to it, and this is an ED that's walked up. And one very interesting insight for us was how engaged all stakeholders, including users and family members and clinicians, were in this process. The team also put up things like costing next to some of the design decisions, and then the stakeholders got invested in saying, I didn't know this cost so much. Maybe we don't need it. So everyone, including the end users, was engaged in this value design rather than the cost-cutting process. The other thing, which is perhaps a little controversial, we also asked was about stakeholder influence, right? So we were continuously hearing that everybody is on the table, everyone has an equal voice. So we wanted to find out, is that true? Do you perceive that you have an equal voice? Now, bear in mind, one of the limitations of the study is we did this during the construction phase, right? So if we did the same survey today, we may get different results. If we had done the same survey in the design phase, we would have gotten different results. But during the construction phase, you can see that there is some significant difference in perceived influence. So across the board, everybody thinks the owner has high influence, right? But when it comes to the influence of the architect, for example, our results showed that they perceived their influence to be significantly lower than the contractors or the owners. Contractors, GCs, on the other hand, perceived the influence of architects to be much higher than how architects themselves perceived it. So this is a lot about perception. It's a lot about you may have a voice, but do you perceive yourself as having a voice? We also did the same analysis around value. So there is cost, but what is value? Because we kept hearing value's definition is what you get versus what you give, but what you get includes quality metrics that you saw in the success metric. So what is that? How do you define value? That was one of our core questions. And although we won't get into it in depth, one of our key takeaways from the qualitative side was perception of value is dependent on who you conceive as the end customer. So for an architect, the end customer is really the owner and to some extent the user. It's similar for the GC, which is very much first the owner and then the user. But the owner sees the end customer purely as the user. So the perception of value and the definitions of value vary a little bit. And you'll see more description on that in the journal article and the full white paper as well. To start wrapping up, in summary, what did we learn about the plus deltas, right? Plus is the advantages, deltas are the opportunities for improvement. And my biggest learning point was that I would say plus and minus, or I would say, okay, what are the positives and negatives? And I remember Zofia said, no, there are no negatives. There are only opportunities for improvement. And that's a delta. So we learned that lesson well. So in the plus deltas, the biggest advantages for Lean IPD are collaboration, working towards common goals, building relationships, user engagement, and very significantly learning and education of both the design teams and the larger community. Because remember, the hospital, as Bernita said, made sure there were local partnerships. So all of that knowledge has now transferred from national experts to local experts, right? The biggest opportunities for improvement, we heard a lot about the need for having accurate cost estimations up early because everything depends on that initial estimation. Being more efficient with the use of time. You're asking for a lot of time, a lot of meetings, a lot of people coming together. So being efficient with that. improve the perception of this imbalance with respect to control and influence. Everybody should not only have the same level of influence legally, but should perceive that they have it. Help team members shift more easily into the lean culture. And of course, something we've been hearing throughout, consider more than first cost as a measure of success. So if we sum it up, again, our biggest takeaway was that learning is a large implicit benefit. How do you put a dollar amount around how much everybody learned and how much benefit that's going to get them in their next project? It's not currently captured by a success metric, but we do need to think about that. Mock-up as the most successful lean strategy. Level of influence of different stakeholders is varied, at least in terms of its perception, so there's an opportunity for us to improve. And then value can mean different things. It's determined more by more quality for lower cost. But the definition of quality is something that's not clear. It's something as an industry we need to work on. And again, evidence-based design really helps us in that. Bernita mentioned that we did a post-occupancy evaluation last year. The paper was published by research that was done in 2014. So we wanted to make sure we shared that with you, that after the project was built and has now been occupied for almost a year, these are some of the larger outcomes. There were no change orders in this project. It was completed 54 days before schedule, significantly under budget, exceeded its energy cost savings targets, did have an increase in patient satisfaction and staff satisfaction, and was very lucky to be considered for the CHD and win a merit in the CHD Touchstone Award. So it does work. It does affect the outcomes. You have managed to save costs, but you have managed to improve value. So to kick off our discussion, what are some of the things we learned about how it can influence practice going forward? First, that perceptions of different stakeholders could be a key driver for the success of the project, so we have to think about those. We have to be respectful of people's time, and a lot of what we heard or learned from the survey findings is that perhaps better planning, better communication, and investing in building trust across teams can be very influential in improving the process overall. Shared learning is a key advantage, which means more time towards education on lean tools, experienced leadership, how to do the whole research, check, do, act process can really be helpful. Visualization of design decisions, like using the mock-up, given that it's so effective, we need to make sure we put funds towards it and think about innovative ways to do it early on and continuously. And then finally, even with shared decision-making processes, sometimes stakeholders may not feel that they have equal voice. So it goes back to the second bullet point that we need to build trust early and keep it continuously. So with that, I know we went a little bit ahead over our speaking time, but I hope this gave a very comprehensive overview. We did have some limitations, like I discussed. We did this project in the construction phase, so maybe if we did it now or we had done it before, it would change. It was based on the perceptions of the team at a specific point in time. The second thing, of course, it's a single case study, right? So we need a larger sample base to make a lot of these conclusions in a way that would be called generalizable. But we hope that the study will serve as a start for some of these discussions. With that, we'd like to open it up for questions. Thank you so much for being with us here.
Thank you so much for your excellent presentation. Before we get into the Q&A session, I'd like to say thank you again to the Herd Journal for providing free access to these articles that we typically review. If you'd like to subscribe to the Herd Journal, go to www.herdjournal.com and use code HERD10 to receive 10% off the annual subscription. Things are moving on their own here. Okay. The Center for Health Design is conducting a patient and staff safety workshop on June 25th, 26th in Chicago. Please be sure to get the early bird pricing, which ends on April 30th. You can learn more about the faculty and agenda on our website under events. And be sure to mark your calendars for the next Evidence-Based Design Journal Club on July 18th. Our featured author will be Megan Twede, discussing her article, Neonatal Intensive Care Unit Layout and Nurses' Work, a very hot topic for all of these redesign issues that we talk about. And now it's your turn to ask the questions of the authors. Please feel free to type your questions in to the chat feature so that everyone can see them, and we'll try to get them answered. The first one that we got was $44 million under budget. Wow. What was the original budget, and where did the cost estimate come from?
So originally we did it, when the project started, we did a validation study, and typically on integrated projects, that's where you start. So based on our understanding of the scope, based on our understanding of the quality that the team could put forward, we put together all the information and came up with an estimate. So the $44 million under budget, I can't remember what the original budget was. I should have came prepared for that. Was based on what the original validation cost. I think it was on the original.
I have $222 million as a number on my notes, Bernita. Yeah, 222.
Okay. So the cost estimate was based on that validation study. So it wasn't. It was based on all the information we knew at the beginning of the project. And honestly, with a typical project, that would have probably killed it. But because it was IPD, the team decided that we would move forward. It was too much. So.
Fantastic. Another user asked, can you please explain how you decided about factors to put on the success metrics? Why POE measures were not included in the success metrics, for example?
So that was, those metrics were created by the team pretty early on in the project. So the team being the integrated project team and the leaders behind those teams. So they were created by that team. The things we did post-occupancy done at a different time. Ideally, I would like to travel back in time and add those to those success metrics specifically. And I think as we continue to do projects, especially projects where, one thing we didn't mention is that many times on these type of projects, our compensation is based on how we perform. So I would tie the POE to these metrics so that our it's not just based on costs and the things we can think of. It's actually based on post-occupancy.
And Bernita, there was one of the staff and family satisfaction. One of those success metrics was for post-occupancy 6 months forward. So one of the parameters was, but the more extensive POE that we did, not all of those parameters were included in the success metrics.
And there were things, there were a couple of things in the POE that related to some of these success metrics.
Very cool. And if you do find a way to travel back in time, I hope you will come back to present that to us as well, because that would be super useful.
Okay. That would be great.
Well, what roles were represented in the user groups? Do they include support services like EVS, facilities, FNS, etc.?
Yeah, we had a cross-functional team from the user side too. So physicians, staff, we had, since it was a pediatric facility, we had parents of former patients. We had social workers. We had pretty much any role in the hospital was assigned to participate in the user design sessions. So every role that was part of it. And if we didn't have someone covered, someone was assigned to act out that particular role.
Okay. You mentioned mock-ups as being the most successful strategy. Lean being lean, isn't that also a cost? Would using something like VR instead of physical mock-ups be more efficient? Would it be as effective?
So the thing about, there's virtual reality is great, and we certainly have used that technology in the design of a facility. But the thing about VR is I actually have to build the space or know what the space is before I can build it. I have to build it virtually. Whereas the mock-ups, all I need is cardboard and a knife. So we have been very successful with using a combination of the cardboard mock-up and the VR. Say, for instance, on something like a patient room. So if I've done extensive research on the best patient room or the best OR or the best clinic, I can build that and have that in my toolbox of a room that I know functions well, and I'm not I'm not creating waste by creating a room I'm going to throw away. So I can put someone in a physical space and give them that headset. The other thing is with VR, I would have to have multiple. The thing with cardboards, I can have an entire team, and I can say, okay, a child is coding in this room. What do you do? And have them act it out. When that's a little bit harder to do with VR. And then the other thing is just it's so much easier to tear down and restart a cardboard mock-up. So we had an instance on this particular project where they started with one OR model that was revolutionary in the industry of pediatrics, of surgery, and we got it approved on paper. So in a traditional design world, we would have built that thing. We would have gone into DD, everybody would have loved it, we would have built it, and they would have moved in, and they would have hated it. And they would have spent hundreds of thousands of dollars renovating that. And what we were able to do is we built it, and they tested it, and they're like, this isn't going to work for us. This isn't going to work for our patients, our culture, how we work together. So overnight, we redid the sketches, we ripped it down, reassembled it, and the next day, the staff worked in. Granted, we had a lot of tired design team members, but the staff walked in and were able to test a brand new layout without spending hundreds of thousands of dollars on change orders.
Well, I bet that went over well.
I think VR is a valuable tool, but there's nothing as raw and quick and easy and has the quick understanding of a three-dimensional space than just dumb materials, cardboard, gator board, whatever you use for that kind of space. And it's actually not that expensive.
And one thing also, Alan, the research team had done was with Zophia's student D, she analyzed what was the cost of that and what was the cost of all the labor associated and really tried to make a business case for that decision, the amount of money you saved on the decision versus the first cost. And like Bernita said, it's really not that expensive. But a big question for us in research overall is what's the right fidelity of visualization for the right decision at the right time? And sometimes it is rapid mock-ups because you can do them and you can take them out and you can do them very quickly. As decisions get more complex and you're looking at more intricacies, then you might need a VR and you might need more detailed visualization. So trying to understand what's the right visualization for the right decision at the right time is something that we do need to learn as an industry and hope to do more research on.
Fantastic. Going back a step, one of our listeners wrote, it's great to hear that there's an interest in putting POE measures into the success metrics, if I could speak. What challenges do you foresee in the market if compensation of the team members are delayed until, let's say, a year after occupancy? Have you done such contracts for any of your other IPD projects?
We had a contract that was based on that, and the owner actually changed their mind. It wasn't our choice. They didn't want the hassle, basically, of doing long-term goals, and there's too much stories and baggage to go into that. But I think we certainly have had situations on specifically IPD projects where our compensation was delayed because of how we rated on goals, or our compensation was delayed. So as a design team member, 85% of our compensation happens in the first parts of construction, before the building's built. A lot of time on IPD projects, that gets delayed because those success metrics delay that release of compensation because the project's not done. So we're already making allowances on these type of projects for that, specifically on the design side. I think it's important enough that it's something that we will continue to look at if that opportunity presents itself. And I think it's a commitment that is important enough, those outcomes are important enough to us, that we would look into the kind of arrangements that would allow us to be compensated based on those outcomes.
Zophia, any thoughts on that too? Are you seeing that as an academic? Do you see that in other projects that you touch?
So far, not so much. I mean, we've had discussions at the Center for Health Systems and Design about, even the question about post-occupancy evaluations. How do you ensure that it's an unbiased study? Obviously, if you have the team itself, engaged in the review process, there's always it's difficult because obviously there's some potential conflicts of interest, and so can we create even having a separate body that that it would not be invested in the process? So there's a lot of additional questions that and challenges that would need to be solved, I think, for it to be a really fair compensation process. It's almost like you really do need an independent third party, I think, to implement it.
Absolutely. I have a couple of related questions here about documentation. The first is, what level of documentation did the design team provide differently than the traditional approach? And then related to that, and maybe tied up in the same answer, is, Polly, you mentioned that all the design rationales were recorded, which I think is just super cool because I'm a great big nerd. I know that the part of the idea of this process was to have everyone on the same page from very early on, but as the project progressed, did you find yourself going back to those design rationales, and if so, how were they used?
So, Bernita, I would let you answer that here.
Okay, so just as far as the documentation thing, I think probably the biggest change for our construction partners on these types of projects is how messy it all is, and it gets messier on these types of projects because it kind of opens up the schedule and the meaning of the word finished or done. So also you get the advantage of being able to do work sharing between design partners and construction partners, where you open up the idea of whoever makes the most sense to draw something, to document something, is the person that documents that. And sometimes that makes it a little bit messy too. So the amount of documentation that you would see on the early part of a project, so before CDs, is greatly reduced in terms of we don't issue batches of drawings anymore. We're issuing drawings as they're needed, or we're issuing sketches, or we're delivering the information on A3s in lieu of, there's no such thing as an SD or DD set. We did our design development in like a science fair kind of approach, where we put all the information that we knew on documents, and then we had the users wander through and comment on whether or not we had enough power and things like that, which is probably pretty weird to most people, but it worked out well because we didn't have to have dedicated meetings, and because we had covered all the equipment and the stuff in the mock-ups, that we were just reacting to operations, and instead of having a sit-down meeting at a conference room talking about what kind of light bulbs they wanted in their room. So the documentation process is completely different. We may have had, a lot of times we went directly into trades in terms of they went directly into fabrication with things, and we're seeing that more and more in the industry, especially with exterior, that we're working with trades on, especially if we did prefabricated panels on this job. So we worked directly with the people creating those and kind of cut out the middle part of the documentation for that. So it's different across the board. We still produce what the authorities having jurisdiction needed us to produce as far as permit drawings. And that's usually the audience. We produce what our owners needed to approve the design as it moved forward, and that's how we based on what we would produce.
Ellen, could I also supplement something that Bernita said? In addition to this particular project, one of the things we do in the world of academia is we collect case studies from around the country, for example, and in response to this question, one thing we noticed that sometimes design teams have explained that the owner will forget. I mean, as they continue to get excited about the project, there's a tendency to get kind of hungry for more features. You've obviously heard the term scope creep. And so documentation allows the design team to return with the owner and revisit the initial criteria. And so if there's some kind of a dispute, we can keep reminding ourselves where were the priorities based on the validation study, in the early part of the project. because unless obviously there's some more funding that comes through or some more opportunity, where you can make the business case, it's really wonderful to have that written down, and I think it keeps everybody focused, including the owner.
And from node to node, Alan, as a research team, for us to have like an innovation log that said these were the key decisions, that each decision is linked to a series of A3s, and you can go to the A3, and the A3 says this was the problem, this was the root cause, this is the research the team did, this is the decision we came to, this is how much money we thought we would save. That was golden. Like, we could review those documents and say, oh, okay, there's a rationale for why this was done, and understand where we should focus.
And the A3s kind of take the place of that traditional documentation, because it also has it has a decision and approval part to it. So the project leadership team had to approve those A3s for us to move on to the next element of the project. So those A3s take over a lot of the traditional documentation that you might see on a traditional project.
And if I can add to that as well, just quickly about, as we know that as baby boomers are starting to retire, there's real concern that a lot of implicit knowledge is going to exit a company with their retirement. The nice thing about all this documentation is it really is downloading and sharing that learning, as Polly had mentioned, so that you can collectively, standardize and climb that stairway, that Kaizen stairway of continuous improvement over time, without, losing the lessons that were learned along the way.
We're running out of time for questions here, and there's so many great ones. A quick and easy one is, would Lean IPD be fitting for a renovation project?
Yes, I've used it for renovation projects. It's actually pretty effective, especially if you're talking about health renovations, because there's so much trade involvement, especially if you're talking about above ceiling things. And renovations are messy in health environment, so I've had pretty good success with those, because we're actually able to get the trades to come in, look above ceiling, come up with solutions that we design into the project, because they're the ones that are actually going to have to build what's going on. And so they can also reduce phases, come up with different ideas to reduce how messy it is. You're making agreements with them because they're the ones that will be possibly disruptive. So I think it's very fitting for renovation projects, and I have a lot of examples of those.
Fantastic. And I guess one last quick question, probably each of you can take this one, is what's the next step? And in research and in practice, building on this work that you've just presented here, you've obviously done more since 2014. What's in the pipeline, and where are you going next?
I'll defer to Sophia to take that first.
So for us, yeah, absolutely. So from a researching perspective, as Polly and Bernita mentioned, life cycle cost analysis is also part of the target value design process, and we're trying to identify which alternatives make sense from a long-term perspective. I've been involved in a number of other organizations, the Health Facilities Committee at Construction Industry, CII, Construction Industry Institute, for example, and this is something that a lot of organizations would like this knowledge, and it does require tremendous collaboration, not just among the companies, but among our various industry stakeholders, even the OAEC community as well. Are we willing to share all that knowledge? Because in the idea of Lean is that we're all better off if we are willing to share that knowledge with each other.
And I would just say that we're about to start on some pretty big projects that are using these methods. So just continuing to increase our knowledge base and improve internally.
And I would add, from a research perspective, one, I think the A3s are amazing database. It would be phenomenal if you could aggregate A3s across all projects and see what knowledge is coming out, what evidence are we using, and what evidence do we need for these decisions. The second thing is the visualization piece that came up earlier. We are really trying to investigate what's the right level of visualization, what should we be using at what time for quick decision-making. And then the post-occupancy question that came up a lot, we do believe that the industry is moving in a direction that we will have responsibility post-occupancy as architects and designers to stay ahead of that is very, very important for us.
Fantastic. Well, thank you very much, Upali, Zofia, and Bernita for this interesting and thoughtful review on the advantages and opportunities for improvement in lean thinking and tools in the integrated project delivery process. This concludes our event. We'll leave the webinar open for another 30 minutes so that you can download the EDAC and AIACEU forms. Thanks again for joining us, and have a great day.